In this episode, we're going to be starting a new book. We're going to be starting Meet Felicity. I'm wearing my red, white, and blue Stars and Stripes shirt today because the 1770s were a very important date for the United States of America. It's when our country was born. In 1776 was when the Declaration of Independence was written, and it was signed on July 4th, 1776. That's why we celebrate the 4th of July. This is Felicity Merriman, and her story is taking place in 1774, at the time right before the Declaration of Independence was written. At this time, there were 13 colonies here where the United States is today, and those colonies were ruled by the King of England all the way across the ocean. The colonists, the people living in the colonies, began to disagree with the King of England and his rules and his taxes. So in some of the Felicity stories, you'll hear the people talking about those disagreements and everybody trying to decide, should the United States separate and be its own country? Which side were people on? Were they for the King of England, or were they for a new country, the United States? So my Felicity doll here is official American Girl, but the furniture I have here is not. It is just furniture that looks like what would have been around in Felicity's time period. So, let's begin Meet Felicity. Chapter 1 is called Merrimans Store. Felicity Merriman pushed open the door to her father's store and took a deep breath. She loved the smell of coffee beans and chocolate, of pine soap, spiced tea, and apples. No other place in the world smelled as good as her father's store. "Good day, Mistress Merriman," said her father. He smiled and bowed. Felicity grinned. Her father always pretended she was a fine lady customer when she came to his store. "Good day, Mr. Merriman," she answered. She liked to pretend, too. "That's a lovely hat you are wearing, young miss. Have you come to buy a new feather for it?" said Mr. Merriman. "Or perhaps you'd like some new ribbon or straw flowers." "Oh, father, you know I don't fancy this old hat at all," giggled Felicity. "I wear it only because Mother insists." She pushed the straw hat off her head so that it hung down her back. "Aye," agreed her father. "It's supposed to shade your face so that the sun does not make your nose red." Felicity rubbed her nose. It was rather pink. "I do forget to wear my hat sometimes," she said. Mr. Merriman smiled. "Sometimes you forget, and sometimes you are in too much of a hurry. I know my impatient girl. But don't fret. I think your nose is very pretty indeed." He tapped Felicity's nose with the tip of his finger. "And now tell me, what did your mother send you to fetch today?" Felicity stood very tall and pretended to be a fine lady again. "A penny's worth of ginger root, if you please, sir." Her father bowed. "Yes, madam, ginger it is," he said. "And here's a bit of rock candy for your trouble." "Thank you, father," said Felicity. She popped the candy in her mouth and tasted its sharp sweetness. While her father weighed the ginger root and wrapped it in newspaper, Felicity looked around the store. The shelves were crowded with bolts of cloth, bowls, bottles, kettles, and coffee pots. Fat-bellied sacks of rice, flour, and salt leaned against barrels of nails. Everywhere Felicity looked, she saw something useful or pleasing. There were aprons, nightcaps, combs, spices, sponges, rakes, fishing hooks, tin whistles, and books. Felicity loved to daydream about the faraway places everything came from. The tulip bulbs came from Holland, the tea from China, and the cotton from India. Felicity believed her father's store was the finest store in Williamsburg, and probably the finest store in all the 13 colonies. The King of England himself didn't go to a better shop in London, Felicity was sure. Mr. Merriman handed Felicity a neatly wrapped packet. "Here's your ginger, Lissy," he said. "Put it safe in your pocket so you won't lose it the way you lost the sugar last week." Felicity put the ginger deep in her pocket. "I didn't quite lose the sugar, Father," she said. "I gave it away." "To a horse," laughed Mr. Merriman. "Ah, yes, now I remember." He winked at his daughter. "I believe you'd give a horse anything. You do love horses, don't you, Lissy?" "Aye," said Felicity, nodding happily. Mr. Merriman patted Felicity's pocket. "Mind you, don't give this ginger to any horse, or I'll be very disappointed. I'm hoping it's meant for a cake to go with my supper this evening. Hurry along home now so you can help bake my ginger cake." "Oh, must I go home, Father?" asked Felicity. Baking a ginger cake at home was not as interesting as helping in the store. Felicity loved to greet customers. Sometimes Father let her help them choose buttons and ribbons to buy. Sometimes she helped Marcus count the boxes and barrels of goods that had come in on ships from England. "May I stay here for a while?" Felicity asked. "May I help Marcus in the storeroom?" "No, Lissy, you needn't stay," said Mr. Merriman. "Have you forgotten? Ben helps Marcus in the storeroom now." "Humph," thought Felicity. "Ben is so quiet and shy. 'Tis easy to forget him." Ben was the new apprentice. Father was teaching him how to run a store. Ben had come to live with the Merrimans 1 month ago. He slept in the loft above the stable and mostly kept to himself. Ever since Ben had come, Mr. Merriman did not need Felicity's help in the store at all. Felicity sighed. She knew where she should be helping, at home. A pile of mending was waiting for her there. Felicity hated the idea of sitting straight and still, stitching tiny stitches, when all the while she was stiff with boredom. She would much rather stay at the store. But her father had already turned back to his work. There was nothing to do but go home. Felicity was in luck. Just as she opened the door to go out, a stout, well-dressed lady sailed in. The lady's hat was decorated with ribbons and feathers that fluttered like leaves in a breeze. Felicity stepped back and held the door open wide. "Mrs. Fidget," said Mr. Merriman happily. "What a pleasure! I haven't seen you since summer began. You look well." Thank you, sir," said the lady cheerily. "You are looking well yourself." She nodded toward Felicity. "And who is this pretty maid?" she asked. "It's not your little Lissy, is it?" Felicity smiled as her father answered, "Indeed, it is Felicity." "Well, well," Mrs. Fidget gasped as if she were surprised. "Dear girl, grown so tall and pretty, hair as bright as a marigold. I'm sure she'll have the lads flocking about Mr. Merriman." Mrs. Fidget turned to Felicity. "Are you ready for the lads to come a-courtin', Miss Felicity?" Are you working on your sampler of stitches to show them how well you sew? No, ma'am, said Felicity. I've not begun a sampler as yet. Not yet? Mrs. Fidget said. Why, my two girls had finished their samplers when they were your age. My Lissy's not much of a one for stitching, said Mr. Merriman. She hasn't the patience. High-spirited, is she? said Mrs. Fidget. Well, Mr. Merriman, your girl will find her patience when she goes looking for it, I'm sure. Wait till she meets a fellow she fancies. She'll settle down fast enough. Lissy is far more interested in horses than fellows, smiled Mr. Merriman. She'd rather go for a horseback ride than to go to a fancy dress ball. He looked at Felicity. Isn't that true, Lissy, my girl? Of course, Father, said Felicity. She did not believe anyone could prefer dancing to riding horses. Horses! Exclaimed Mrs. Fidget. That reminds me why I came to your store today. I want to order oats for our horses to eat. Will you have your man bring a sack of oats round to my house, Mr. Merriman? I'll have my new apprentice do it, said Mr. Merriman. Ben is going to deliver a new bit and harness to Jiggy Nye at the tannery this afternoon. He will bring the oats to your house on his way. Very well, said Mrs. Fidget. She lowered her voice to a gossipy tone. I know why that good-for-nothing Jiggy Nye wants a new harness and bit. I hear he's got himself a new workhorse. He won it gambling, some such thing. In any case, he didn't pay for it, mind you. Felicity listened closely. She wanted to hear more about Mr. Nye's new horse. But Mrs. Fidget frowned and said, Oh, I believe he worked his old horse to death. That man is a cold-hearted scoundrel. He is not to be trusted. You'd better tell Ben to be sure Jiggy pays him for the harness right away. That I will, agreed Mr. Merriman. I'll take no promises for payment from Jiggy. His money would be drunk up before I'd see it. Mr. Merriman glanced at Felicity and stopped talking. But Felicity knew all about Mr. Nye. Everyone knew he drank too much rum. When he did, he went into rages and left his work undone. His house was always a mess, and his fences were always falling down. Felicity didn't dislike him for any of those reasons. She hated Mr. Nye because he killed poor cows and horses that were too old to work anymore and made leather from their hides. What's Mr. Nye going to do with his new horse? He's not going to work it to death too, is he, Father? Asked Felicity. Don't you worry about Jiggy Nye's new horse, said Mr. Merriman. I'm sure it's strong and healthy. Jiggy would be foolish to mistreat it. He kissed Felicity on the forehead. Now you run along home. Your mother will be wondering what's become of you and that Ginger. Goodbye, my child. Goodbye, Father. Good day, Mrs. Fidget, said Felicity. Farewell, Miss Felicity, said Mrs. Fidget. Felicity stepped out into the bright afternoon. She walked home thinking only one thing. Jiggy Nye has a new horse, and I'm going to see it, somehow, as soon as I can. And that's the end of the first chapter. So you might have noticed the language in this book is a little bit old-fashioned because it was quite a long time ago that Felicity lived. The language was a little bit more formal, and you might hear some unusual words, like boys called lads. Girls at this time were supposed to be working on sewing skills so that they could prove they would make a good wife someday. And so that's what Mrs. Fidget was talking about when she mentioned a sampler. A sampler would show all the stitches that a girl could do. But girls like Felicity really didn't have the patience or interest in some of those things. And you'll probably also notice in the story how inexpensive things are. They talked about just paying a penny for some items in the store. And that's because things a long time ago did not cost as much as they do today. That's the end of chapter 1. Tune in next time to find out if Felicity gets to take a look at Ginny and I's horse.